Welcome to the Bible Journey. My name is Mark Green. I'm pastor of adult ministries here at Otterbein Church. We jumped into 2 Corinthians last week, and we are going to make our way through this wonderful letter over the next few weeks. Let me remind you, in chapters 1 through 7, Paul is moving towards reconciliation with the Corinthians after a previous conflict. There had been a conflict between them. Paul had written a hard letter, and then he had come and had a hard conversation. And after he had left, some people who weren't completely convinced of everything attempted to stir up the conflict again, and Paul writes this letter to close the loop. In chapter 1, Paul responded to some accusations leveled against him by some of the teachers in the Corinthian church. Why had they rejected Paul in the first place? Well, some there had disregarded Paul as a credible leader. He was poor, believe it or not. Paul was poor and earned a meager living through manual labor. He was a tent maker when he came and did manual labor, and they were looking at him because these false teachers were wealthy and well-dressed and well-spoken. He was under constant persecution, and he was often homeless. And to top it all off, Paul, they said, you're not a very impressive public speaker, at least compared to the professional teachers who had come through. So people began to accuse him of not being credible, like the more wealthy and well-spoken teachers. Well, once the Corinthians were exposed to more wealthy and impressive Christian leaders, they started to think less of Paul and eventually became ashamed of him. And Paul is writing this letter to reconcile this. Paul begins chapter 2 by expressing the pain he felt for the painful visit he had to make to them that he had made earlier. He acknowledges the pain. Boy, it was hard having to come to you and say the things I had to say. There were some teachers who were leading the Corinthians astray by disparaging Paul. Paul says that future pain can be avoided. How? We can avoid more pain by loving one another. And how is this love to be demonstrated? By forgiving the person who instigated the conflict. Do you see the progression here? An offense has occurred. The offending person has been confronted. Forgiveness needs to be given. And when forgiveness is given and accepted, the schemes of Satan are defeated. In verses 12 to 16, Paul depicts himself and the other apostles as captive slaves to King Jesus, who is leading a procession of triumph. What Paul is doing is pulling a Roman image of a conquering general entering into the city after having won a significant battle. And Paul is taking that imagery and comparing it to Christ and his triumph. Oftentimes, when a Roman general would win a big victory, they would come marching back into town, and a processional would meet them outside the city, and behind the general would be conquered leaders of the army he had conquered, and oftentimes before him, people would walk with incense and singing, and they were walking before him to proclaim the winning general is returning. Everybody gather and celebrate this. And it's meant to communicate victory. And Paul says, who is leading this beautiful, magnificent procession? It's not Paul. Paul says, it's not me leading this. It's not the teachers who were seeking to exalt themselves. But in this procession, it is Christ himself. And the people following Christ, specifically the apostles, are spreading the aroma of Christ, the gospel, and their lives to those who accept and believe, rather than those who reject. So Paul is painting a picture of him and the apostles as walking before King Jesus, waving incense and proclaiming, here's the conquering king, worship him. And he's accusing these false teachers of not doing that, of calling attention to themselves instead of following Jesus. In chapter 3, Paul alludes to the Corinthians' recent demand that he provide a letter of recommendation from other apostles in order to prove his authority and credentials. This is almost comical. They're saying, hey, Paul, we need some letters from better people than you, confirming and affirming that you are that you have the authority and credentials to be an apostle. And Paul's like, this is so silly. Paul says, if it wasn't for me in my ministry unto the Lord, this church wouldn't even exist. Is it not me who started it? And does that not prove my leadership? And does that not show in and of themselves my letter of recommendation? Verse 2 reads, "You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts, to be known and read by all." Paul's confidence is rooted in Christ, who has worked through him to their benefit. And he cleverly quotes Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, saying that God's Spirit has written his letter of love on the hearts of his covenant people. And he's saying to the Corinthians, you don't need any more recommendations than you yourselves. You are my letter, because unto Christ I came, I preached the gospel, you responded to the gospel, a church was formed. You are my letters of recommendation. The mention of the new covenant leads Paul into this comparison of the old covenant between God and Israel, mediated by Moses, and the new covenant between God and the Corinthians, mediated by Jesus and the Spirit. The old covenant made at Mount Sinai was truly glorious, making Moses himself shine with God's glory, but that glory eventually faded. Not to mention, the laws of the covenant were ineffective at truly transforming Israel. The new covenant, on the other hand, is even more glorious because the resurrected Jesus is the glory of God. He lives on forever, and the Spirit is transforming people to become more faithful to Jesus. Notice how Paul explains the difference between the transformation of Moses when he came down from Mount Sinai in Exodus 34 and the transformation of the people who have encountered Jesus. If you go back and read that text, Moses met God up on the mountain, and because he had been in the presence of God, he came down from the mountain and his face shone with the glory of God. But that radiance began to fade, and Moses put a veil over his face, so when talking to the people, they would not see that his face began to lose that radiance. Then Paul says Moses is an example about the coming of Christ, because unlike Moses and unlike the law, the coming of Christ was brighter than the law, and what was initiated at Mount Sinai would one day be eclipsed by Christ himself. What was given at Mount Sinai was good, and the face of Moses shone, but it was temporary. The coming of Christ brought eternal salvation that would last for all time. Verses 15 to 18. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image, from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. In other words, the new covenant is even more glorious because the resurrected Jesus is the glory of God. He lives on forever, and his Spirit is transforming people to become like Jesus himself. When the law is read, the people react as if a veil is over their hearts, and they refuse to see that Christ is removing that veil in order to redeem them and transform them. And what Paul is doing is drawing this comparison. Moses put a veil over his face so they would not see the radiance being fade. And Paul is saying when the gospel is presented, you're acting like there's a veil over your face, preventing you from hearing the truth and being set free. And he says, this is amazing. Who wouldn't want to share in God's glory? But Paul is going to go on in chapters 4 to 7 to show how the paradox of the cross turns the Corinthians' idea of glory and success upside down. In chapter 4, Paul returns to the theme of this divine appointment, of his divine appointment and provision to be a minister of the gospel. You want my letters of recommendation. You want all this affirmation. The gospel itself proves that I have been sent by God. He and the apostles have been commissioned by God. They need no devious or underhanded or cunning practices in order to communicate the gospel. These other teachers were coming in and they were smooth talkers, but Paul says, if you strip away their language, you're going to hear there's no substance there. Plain speech is sufficient because it is not fancy words, but simple words that are causing the people to respond. They are not responding, Paul says. It's not because you didn't understand. It's because Satan is blinding your minds to the truth. But to those who are redeemed, they have the light of Christ in them. But Paul says, but we have the light of Christ in us as fragile vessels. Our fragility is to our benefit. That sounds so crazy. Being fragile is to our benefit. Why? Because our weakness and fragility provide an opportunity for God to demonstrate the surpassing power of Christ in us. In verses 7 to 12, Paul goes on a short rant about the paradox of Christianity. Weakness demonstrates the power of God. Strength demonstrates that we're walking in our flesh. And allow me to read a couple of these verses to you because they're so wonderful, and it communicates how we walk in the Christian life. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Do you see what he's doing here? All these things that we consider bad are providing benefit. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. You see what Paul's doing? Affliction brings benefit. Why? Because we're modeling Christ. And because Christ is in us, death is not winning, but life is winning. And what would cause us? What would cause Paul? What would cause the Corinthians? What would cause you and I to have such a view? It is the hope of the resurrection. Jesus suffered, was raised from the dead. We suffer and will also be raised from the dead. Paul is saying in most simple terms, we get to be like Jesus. That is the message of the gospel. We get to have Jesus, and then we get to be like Jesus. So don't lose heart. Yes, our outward bodies are suffering greatly, but each day we are being renewed by a greater glory of Christ in us. Don't let the temporary transient become the greater, but allow the eternal, the greater, to inform the lesser. Well, we'll pick up with chapters 5 and 6 next time as Paul moves towards this climax of reconciliation. May you find great joy in your journey of reading the Bible this week.